So they made a choice at that time to prefer expansion to security. A peace treaty with Egypt, which is the only substantial military force in the Arab world, that would have meant security, but expansion was preferable. The question was how the U.S. is going to respond, as always. There was an internal debate in the United States. The State Department was in favor of Sadat's offer, not very far from official U.S. policy at the time. Henry Kissinger, who was National Security Advisor, was opposed. He was in favor of what he called stalemate, meaning no negotiations, just the mailed fist. And it was assumed at the time, both in the United States and Israel, that Israeli military power was so overwhelming that there's nothing that any of the Arabs could do about it, so we could dismiss them. Kind of another variant of the Muasher doctrine. If they can't do anything, we'll take what we want. Very triumphalist spirit at that period, which they lived soon to regret. So the offer was rejected. President Sadat expelled Russian advisors to try to indicate to the United States that he wanted to become basically an American satellite. Kissinger laughed. Israel laughed. He kept saying that Yamit means war. In other words, if Israel refuses to withdraw from Egyptian territory, there's going to have to be a war. Israel and the United States paid no attention. They ridiculed it. It's good literature on this, incidentally, in Israel. I tried to get it translated, but no American publisher would touch it, so you can read it in Hebrew or French, but not English, the French translations. And it basically describes an arrogant, racist, triumphalist attitude. Arabs don't know which end of the gun to hold. We can do what we like. Well, in 1973, Sadat followed through on his warnings. There was a war. And for Israel, it was a very close thing. Worst danger in the history of the state. They came close to destruction. They were even beginning to plan to use nuclear weapons as a last step. Finally, with massive U.S. military aid, they managed to turn the tide. But Kissinger realized, and the Israeli leadership realized, that they can't simply disregard Egypt. They can't regard it as a basket case. At that point, negotiations began, famous shuttle diplomacy, Kissinger flying up and back. Finally, in 1978, 1979, at Camp David, the United States and Israel more or less accepted Sadat's 1971 proposals, actually in a form then which was harsher from the U.S.-Israeli point of view, because in the interim period, Palestinian national rights had entered the international agenda, and Sadat was insisting on Palestinian rights. I mean, Carter, who was the American president, accepted it. Menachem Begin, the Israeli prime minister, claimed to accept it or rejected it. But Israel and the United States did agree that Israel would withdraw from the Sinai. And that's the peace treaty, 1979 peace treaty with Israel and Egypt. Now that's described here as a great diplomatic triumph. Look, we brought peace to Israel and Egypt. Actually, it's a diplomatic catastrophe. By rejecting the proposal in 1971, Washington paved the way for an extremely dangerous war. Lots of suffering and misery, terror, violence, and finally agreed to something like the proposal that they'd rejected in 1971. Well, that's the actual story, but not the story you read. You can easily check up the details. They're not obscure. Well, meanwhile, as I say, the Palestinian issue had entered the international arena. The 1971 proposal of withdrawal by Sadat offered nothing to the Palestinians. It just treated them as refugees, no national rights, nothing else. But that changed. In 1976, January 1976, the major Arab states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, what are called the confrontation states, the ones in direct conflict with Israel, they brought a resolution to the United Nations Security Council calling for a settlement on the international border, which would, with Israel within its territory, a Palestinian state, and the territories that Israel would evacuate. And then they added the wording of UN 242. That's the resolution that everyone agrees, at least in principle agrees, is the major operative resolution that calls for a recognition of the rights of every state in the region to live in peace and security behind internationally recognized borders. So that's what the January 1976 resolution called for. Israel refused to attend the session. The United States vetoed the resolution. That happened again in 1980 under Carter. I won't run through the rest of the record, but it's about the same. The regular resolutions, usually at the General Assembly, overwhelmingly supportive of a two-state settlement. The votes are maybe 151 to 2, U.S. and Israel. Sometimes the U.S. picks up some Pacific island or something like that. But that's the regular voting record, and it continues right up till the present. In fact, to this moment, right now, the Security Council is considering a Lebanese resolution supported by about 120 countries, which calls for Israel to terminate expansion of settlements in the occupied territories. And it also, the resolution declares all the settlements to be illegal. Well, the fact that the settlements are illegal is not even controversial. In fact, Israel agreed to that back in 1967. I'll come back to that. Ending settlement expansion is official U.S. policy. Nevertheless, the United States indicated at the Security Council that it's right now trying to block the resolution. It says if it's voted on, the United States will veto it. That's what they've been indicating at the Security Council, which is an effort to prevent the resolution from being even considered. Well, that's our current position. Let's go back to 1967, when Israel conquered what are the currently occupied territories. Very quickly, Israel began settlement activities, partly in the Sinai, the ones I've mentioned, partly in the West Bank. And the question came up whether inside Israel, whether this was legal. Israel's highest legal authorities informed the government that any settlement in the occupied territories is in violation of a core international law. The Attorney General agreed. He said, yes, that's certainly true. In the cabinet, the defense minister, Moshe Dayan, who was in charge of the occupied territories, he agreed. He said, yes, of course, the settlements we're beginning are illegal, but countries violate international law, and we'll do it too. And they can, as long as the boss says it's okay, just as India and Israel can violate the Non-Proliferation Treaty as long as the boss in Washington says that's fine, it doesn't apply to you, and so on, just as the United States itself can freely violate international law. We have the authority to do it, self-determined, and if we like, we apply it to our clients and allies. So Dayan was correct. Yes, they can violate international law if they like, and they proceeded with the settlements. That they're all illegal is not even in question. It's repeatedly been affirmed not only by the highest Israeli authorities, by the Security Council, by the International Court of Justice, with the U.S. Justice agreeing in a separate resolution that any settlement in the occupied territory, and anything done to protect them, any infrastructure for them, is de facto in violation of international law. But that unanimous position, and incidentally the U.S. voted for many of those Security Council resolutions, it doesn't matter as long as the boss says you can violate international law. So the settlements are illegal, and it's understood, but they can continue as long as the United States provides the critical diplomatic, military, economic, and indeed ideological support. The ideological support is by suppressing most of what happened. So, for example, the facts I just mentioned, which are not in the least controversial, you can check them yourself, there's no question about them, they're unknown because we have a very efficient doctrinal system. It allows certain things through and other things not through. It's just like, say, what's happening in Tahrir Square, or what happened in Gaza during the U.S.-Israeli attack last year. You could see live television footage of it 24 hours a day if you're in any country outside the United States, and namely by watching Al Jazeera, a highly respected channel. But in the United States, you can pick it up on the internet, but you can't watch it on television because we're closed. Or to be precise, there are 2 small cable stations in the country that agree to run it, but no one else. So free society, but we have mechanisms of constraining the information that reaches the public, and they're pretty effective. So I add ideological support to the diplomatic, military, and economic support. For example, the current discussion about the veto of the Lebanese Security Council resolution, it's not totally suppressed. I think there were 5 lines about it in the New York Times, but you have to be a pretty dedicated researcher to find out any of these things, and a lot more. I'm sure you know there were headlines about this. President Obama sent a special representative to Egypt, Wisner, old CIA background, to talk to Mubarak, to try to, in theory, to try to ask him to resign. Robert Fisk, British correspondent, very good British correspondent, he was able to expose the fact that the American press either couldn't find or didn't want to find, that Wisner is a member of the major lobbying firm for Mubarak. That's the person you send to Cairo to convince Mubarak to move to the side. Well, there are only 2 possibilities. Either the Obama administration is, incompetent to a level that's almost unimaginable, like they couldn't discover that what a British journalist could, that their representative is part of the major lobbying firm that lobbies for Mubarak, or else it's just pure cynicism. It's the standard game plan. We tell them quietly, we really don't care, or maybe you should move aside, and your sidekick, Omar Suleiman, should move in. He's the U.S. choice now, and a reasonable choice. He's the head of Egyptian intelligence, responsible for terror, the person responsible for rendition. When the U.S. wants to send people to be tortured, rendition, send them to places like Egypt, where they're pretty good at torturing people, and Suleiman's in charge of that, so kind of a good person.